Great, we're live on YouTube now. So welcome everyone to day 2 of the Education in Crisis Conference 2021. We're now going to move on to our 4th and final roundtable at this conference. This roundtable is titled Rethinking Gender in Education. And in this session, we aim to understand how the pandemic has impacted gender and social hierarchies across the region, and in what ways we can hope to rethink the gender question when it comes to education. We have some really exciting gender academics and activists and educationists from across South Asia, and I'm really excited to hear from all of them today. This session will be chaired by Cecilie Mueenuddin from the University of Oxford. I now hand over to Cecilie to begin the discussion. Please note that the conversation will last for 1 hour, followed by 30 minutes of audience Q&As. If you're attending the conference on Zoom, please feel free to type in your questions on the Q&A section in Zoom. And also if you're watching us live on YouTube, please send us your questions on live chat. Really excited to see all the speakers here. Thank you for being here. And Cecilie, over to you.
Thank you, Mohini. And thank you all for joining us here today for what promises to be a very interesting discussion on gender and education. As everyone knows by now, gender has been one of the big topics of the pandemic, particularly because school closures and homeschooling have had effects beyond the education setting, and has exposed more clearly the gender inequalities at home. Not only has it been women who have mostly ended up with the job of managing their children's homeschooling, but more people at home has also meant more housework and care work. And many women have also had to manage this extra work burden alongside their own jobs, which has brought a lot of women to the edge of burnout or beyond. And I suspect that female students across South Asia have also often been pulled into the work at home when they should otherwise have been studying. And my own research focuses on masculinity in the Pakistani middle class. So my understanding of the effects of the pandemic in South Asia is mostly based on how the Pakistani middle class has experienced it. But I'm sure the pandemic has had different effects on gender depending on caste and class, among other things. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what the panelists here have to say about education and gender, since we have such a great panel covering different parts of South Asia here. So the plan for the session is, as Mohini said, the panelists will give some introductory remarks followed by discussion. And then for the last half an hour or so, we'll take questions from the audience, and then you're welcome to pop your questions in the Q&A box or raise your hand and wait until I call on you. So then we'll start. And the first person to speak is Shanila Kojamuji. She's an assistant professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Bowdoin College in the US, and has written about education for girls in Pakistan, as well as a recently published book on sovereignty and Pakistani masculinities. So over to you, Shenila.
Thank you, Cecilia. I wanted to begin by first thanking the organizers for bringing us together, for taking up this topic, and I'm looking forward to what hopes to be a generative discussion. As we all know by now, the pandemic has exacerbated prevailing disparities. The Malala Fund, for instance, recently came out with a report saying that an additional 10 million girls may never return to school. So one immediate response to such statistics is to figure out interpersonal and also state interventions that can get girls to schools. But since one of the areas that the organizers asked us to contemplate was new areas of research, I wanted to propose 2 additional lines of inquiry. The first area for exploration, I think, might be for us to understand how local communities, and these could be religious communities, neighborhoods, particularly those communities that have not been able to partake in this pivot to online learning due to limited internet connectivity or simply due to social class. What forms of new educative avenues have such communities devised? These might be new ways of learning, but they could also be a strengthening of structures of knowledge transmissions that were already existing alongside schools. And I mentioned this because the group of girls that I work with in Pakistan They attend both day and night school, with the night school being run by their religious communities. And during this pandemic, it is this volunteer-run organization that has stepped up to fill in the gaps in the girls' learning trajectory. And so perhaps an exploration around how communities are fending for themselves and what institutions of mass learning could learn from them might be helpful. Of course, this might be in addition to us thinking about how do we consider what knowledges are worthy of studying, and how do we conceptualize these non-schooling avenues of learning as well. The second area would be to understand along the lines that Cecilie just mentioned around the implications of increasing burden of care that has fallen on women and girls. Of course, conversations around paid and unpaid care labor are a mainstay in feminist research, but the pandemic is also making it glaringly obvious that there exists a divide between those who provide this care labor and those whose needs for care are privileged. So perhaps education researchers can consider what frameworks of care and caring labor and how they are gendered and racialized across different national contexts, what these frameworks might offer for our conceptualization and theorization of contemporary South Asian girlhoods, of teaching labor, of a broader feminist politics in South Asia in the future. I think attending to the politics of care will also enable us to establish transnational solidarities, not only because the inequalities that we are observing on the ground in South Asia are intimately linked with the politics of the global North, but also because the efforts for rebuilding and imagining a new future are also connected. Thank you, and I look forward to further engaging.
Great, thank you so much, Shenila. That was very interesting. Lots of interesting things to think about there. Okay, so the next person we have is Pooja Pant, and she's a co-founder and executive director at Voices of Women Media in Nepal, and is also a filmmaker, a women's rights activist, and a video journalist working with young women in Nepal. And then over to you, Pooja.
Hi, I hope you guys can hear me. I'm outside of Kathmandu and my internet is terrible, so I will just stick to my voice. I have sent Uma a small PowerPoint presentation that I see she's playing right now. So if at any time you can't hear me, please do let me know by text so I can see it. So I've prepared a little bit of a slide for you guys, just to have a visual kind of reference to what I'm speaking about. I kind of want to talk a little bit about our introduction to our work around education in Nepal. So since 2019, Vow Media, we started a program called TechnoHub, where it's an educational program that specifically works with young girls in government-run high schools, secondary high schools, so 8th to 10th graders. We work with 3 different schools in central Kathmandu. And before the pandemic, they would come to the TechnoHub Center 3 times a week, where they were given multimedia and technology training. We have a fully equipped computer lab and a multimedia center with cameras and a makeshift studio. So we created a curriculum specifically based on their needs after numerous meetings with them and their teachers. And we also created library memberships with them at a feminist library, which is housed at Vow Media, called Junkiri. So the girls are, besides multimedia and computer trainings, they're also reading books and discussing contents of the books. You can just move to the next slide, Uma. Thank you. So fast forward to the pandemic. In March 2020, when the world went into a lockdown, so did Nepal. And children from slightly better off families had access to internet, laptops, and mobile technologies, but these young girls that we worked with had nothing, not even a telephone. These young girls all came from very impoverished families, and most of the times only the parents have a telephone. If they did have an extra smartphone or a laptop at home, it's almost exclusively for the use of the sons in the family. So what we did is we paid for the top-ups of the telephones of their parents' phone, and then they were allowed to use it so we could be in touch with them. And we were absolutely at a loss of how to work with the girls again. You know, how does one teach technology when there is an absolute lack of it. We can move to the next slide. Okay. So what we did, or how we did it, is we understood that in order to kind of go forward, we have to step backwards. We have to go back to the basics. So right from the beginning, you know, we started working with the girls. We taught them how to create WhatsApp groups. And then we did this so we could remain in touch with them in these difficult times. But eventually, as they got familiar with communicating with us and with each other through WhatsApp groups, we started giving them assignments. We can move to the next slide. So the first assignment we gave them was to create a daily lockdown journal. So they would write a page, take a photo, and share it with us on WhatsApp. Like, this was the only way that we could get them to be, you know, active and sharing their stories. And then eventually, when they felt comfortable enough, what we did is we have a website called She is the Story, where we created a series called the Lockdown Series, and we published their stories through the website. And this got them super inspired to write and to share their stories online so other people could understand what they were going through. With the digital divide kind of getting wider and wider, they understood that they were being left behind, but that didn't want that, you know, they didn't want that to silence them. So they were very active in sharing their stories with us through using this digital medium. You can go to the next slide. So as they slowly got familiar with online communications, we got them to download Zoom and started weekly sessions, but we really couldn't give them much technological education, you know, like they didn't have anything to use. We couldn't teach them how to type, for example, or, you know, anything. So we then kind of started veering towards a bit more theoretical knowledge on various issues. So we had sessions, weekly sessions with them, where we would invite a speaker to facilitate a workshop on various issues, ranged from identity to feminism to LGBTQI rights to digital safety and security to well-being to caste-based discrimination, human trafficking, to just something as simple as art and a dance workshop. Next slide. So this was one of the sessions we did where we had a transgender activist come and facilitate a workshop on Pride Month. And this was the artwork that they created after their session. So what is the way forward? You know, we are absolutely at a loss of what the way forward is on how we can continue educating these young girls and young girls such as them. Young girls from communities that are in the margins are most affected by the pandemic in education. Online classes are too far out of their reach. And even when they can access online classes, they're not very conducive to participation. They get very bored, and it's very impractical to think of it as a long-term solution. You know, we've tried and tried and tried to make things as interesting for them, but the participation has dropped to like more than half at this point, because what's happening is that a lot of the young girls, now that we're out of a lockdown, a lot of the young girls have had to, you know, stop their classes or stop any kind of education that they're receiving and go out and work so they can help their parents to sustain a life. So what's happening is when education gets difficult to access, the girls are at a higher risk of getting married off early, child labor, having to go work because the increase in poverty level is suffered by their families. Reports are showing that child marriage and child labor has increased because of the pandemic. So the last slide. And gender divide is a serious issue when it comes to, you know, technological access, literacy. these young girls who do not have access to such tools of technology are, slowly and slowly being left behind as the world technologically advances. So I wish I had a better and a bit more positive and solution-based conclusion, but unfortunately, we are very much at a loss of how to go about it. We try to make it as interesting for the young girls, but the gender gap has and will increase because of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja. That was a little bit depressing, but very interesting.
I'm sorry. I tried to make it positive, especially at the end, but I was like, no, there's nothing positive about it.
Exactly. No, it's a very tough situation to find something positive in, but yeah, that was nevertheless interesting and kind of an inspiring project. We're trying to find alternative ways of reaching these girls. The next speaker we have is Seuty Sabur, and she is an associate professor of anthropology at BRAC University, Bangladesh, and is also an activist working with gender issues in Bangladesh.
Hi, thank you, Cecilie. Especially thanks to Mohini for inviting me to this wonderful panel, and I'm honored to be here. I will start with, again, I would echo Pooja in so many ways. The pandemic unleashed new world order that is even more unequal than the one we lived before. In countries like Bangladesh, survival trumped the luxury called education. Educational institutions bore the brunt of endless lockdowns, which have been going on for over 1.5 years now. The ineptitude of University Grants Commission and relative ministry repeatedly created chaos and divide among the private and public institutions. We were not even considered for the millions of dollars worth of stimulus package that was handed out to save various sectors. How did all this impact students and teachers' experience in tertiary education? I will share my experience as an educator, administrator working at the BRAC University and an activist based in Bangladesh. I'll start with best practice that I think was the best practice at BRAC University. And then I'll talk about the things that we have learned along the way. Even though BRAC University is completely dependent on revenue generated by student fees and does not receive any endowment from the government, the university could still sense the vulnerability of the students and proactively implemented a financial care package, including 10% tuition waiver, a broadened installment plan, need-based financial aid to the students in financial distress, and special assistance to obtain better internet access, pledging an assistance package worth of 1.8 million or equivalent to 25% of total tuition fees. In addition, university continued to provide the regular need-based and merit-based scholarship as it has in the past. We transitioned from partial learning management system LMS to a robust edX-based teaching and learning platform called BUX and introduced Slack for the team and class management. Google Classroom was also introduced. Almost all the lectures were pre-recorded and uploaded, while live classes were held through Google Meet, Zoom, but were not mandatory. Students with less internet bandwidth or other connectivity issues could thus avail all lectures at their convenient time. From summer 2020, the system was up and running and has been functioning seamlessly. Evaluation and assessments were reconfigured to account for the change and difficult circumstances. Yet, all this also pronounced and reproduced class, gender, and digital divide. These innovations definitely helped the students, but there was much more that needed to be done. There are few things we learned along the way. And first and foremost would be the class and digital divide that we were made aware of. Many of our students came from working or lower middle class background, and many supported or funded their own education. Shutdowns not only affected their family financially, but they lost their source of income too. This resulted in a spike in semester drop, especially for the female students. The digital divide has been glaring between urban and rural students, and those with smartphones, personal computers, and those without them. Except for Dhaka, Chittagong, and few big cities, internet connections were unstable, and we had to run live classes with only 20 to 40% of the students, while only 60% of the student could access the pre-recorded classes reliably. Many of the students neither had personal computers nor smartphone to ride the tide. And once again, it was the female students who were predominantly the ones without reliable access. Second and major concern that we had was the care work. Care work and domestic chores occupied many of my students' time, especially female students. They were constantly surveilled by their parents and lacked privacy or safe space to even focus in their studies. Students who lived by themselves without family support were affected both financially and emotionally. One of our brightest students who was supporting her own education and lived alone fell prey to robbery of her possessions, losing income, betrayal from peers, and eventually committed suicide last month. COVID-19 has increased toxicity in household with a prominent increase in cases of domestic violence. At least 2 cases were reported to me by 2 female students, both brutally beaten by the family members, which in one case was the mother. As an educator, I could not intervene, but as an activist, we maneuvered a support team and shelter home. But in the end, they simply couldn't make the decision as their education was still dependent on the family, even though they had substantial income pre-COVID. By shutting down the universities, we denied them the access to the only safe space they had, as well as the counseling services that might have helped them. Finally, I'll be talking a little about the health issue, both mental and physical. Online classes ended up taking 3 to 5 times more preparation for both students and teachers. Being tied to the computer for 14 to 16 hours resulted in chronic migraine, back pain, neuralgia, nerve damage, loss of eyesight, partial loss of eyesight among my students and colleagues. The sense of loss, inaccessibility to physical classroom, being away from friends took a toll on their mental health too. 3 out of 5 students reported anxiety and depression. Only a handful of them had the access or the resources to the treatment. In most cases, support was denied, especially for female students. Being tied to the computer for such a long hour of a day for academic and administrative work, taking care of the families while bidding farewell to our dear ones, we were the first responders to our students' emotional need. We collectively failed to provide a nurturing space for the students, especially during the pandemic, when they should have been made to feel more secure. Education institution cannot fight this battle alone. With that note, I end my conversation.
Thank you, Seuty. That was again not terribly uplifting, but very, very interesting to hear how the universities have dealt with it there, and the students as well. Let's see, the next person we have on our list is Anuradha Das Mathur. She is the founder and dean of the Vedica Scholars Program for Women in India, which is a women-only management and leadership program. She's also the founder of one media company, the 99 Media, and the managing director of another, the CFO Collective. Over to you.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and thanks Cecilia and also Mohini, who helped set up the Vedica Scholars Program for Women. So it's a double delight to be on this panel and at this conference. I hope that I've heard the speakers so far, and there is no taking away from how dreary and how difficult the last 18 months have been, both from an education and a gender point of view specifically. But I think all complex issues really do have the potential to throw up as much of an upside or at least some upside in the middle of all the things that are seemingly wrong. So I hope that I'm able to bring some of that to the fore. I think just in terms of context, what I want to mention is that, in the middle of everything that India gets beaten on for, we have made consistent progress in women's education. In 2019, women made up almost 50% of enrollments in higher education. This was almost a 20% increase in female enrollment between sort of 2015 and 2020. From a policy perspective, from a government perspective, women's education has been receiving a whole lot of attention in the last decade or so. And one can see the impact in numbers. And I'm not yet going to what this means in terms of quality. Of course, the pandemic has had all the detrimental effects that we have been talking about. And like some others have mentioned, norms determine women's access to technology. Often this is dominated by the men or male relatives in a household. So the digital access gender gap has obviously deepened the educational divide. Some surveys have suggested that only 18% of young women, actually it says unmarried women, between 15 and 21 have a mobile phone compared to 65% of the men. 33% of the women own mobile phones compared to 68 or 70% amongst men. And the population of female internet users is half that of male users, according to a 2019 report in India. So seemingly, of course, women are at a huge disadvantage, given that education is now being pushed through the digital platforms. I think there are a couple of other things. When incomes are hit, most families prioritize the male child's education. A woman's education is seen as not being as multiplier oriented. It doesn't do much for the rest of the people. And I'm not talking about what it means for children's health, et cetera, but in terms of sort of return on investment, which may not be the best way to think about it, but it does become a part of the way families look at putting their money. And therefore, this also translates into the expenditure that you would make on an electronic device for your daughter's education as opposed to your son's, because the first one, because the son's is an investment and the daughter's is considered an expense. Again, I think, Cecilia, you mentioned this even in your opening remarks, that girls are burdened with greater domestic responsibilities when they're working from home. So, of course, it takes away from their ability to focus. I think one of the other things is that in recent years, in the last 2 years or so, government revenue and also CSR funds that were a big source of support for women's education have dried up because they've all been repurposed towards the pandemic. So I think there's a whole host of factors that point towards the fact that the gender divide is only deepened for education. But the truth is that, at least in a country like India, there has been over a period of time great hesitation to send girls outside of the house to go out and study. Now, when the physical need to go away from home reduces or is not required because everyone is home, I think there is also the counter that a girl's access to the possibility of education has gone up. Also, the fact that there has been a lot of focus on better quality content being created for online consumption. The fact that these are bite-sized, that there is multimedia being explored. So I think there is definitely an upping of the quality of the content that has been created in the last 18 to 20 months because of the focus on digital. I think in India, remote learning could definitely play a big role if done properly for women who don't have access to decent education and schooling. And I think there's one more piece that we've been thinking about. There's a lot of women who drop out of the workforce. So while it's not strictly higher education, I think the opportunity for women to reskill or repurpose their past education to be able to make another entry into the workforce. I think that has also improved with the fact that there is so much focus on the digital platforms. Of course, I do want to make a reference to a very well-known educator in India who said there is no online education, there is only online learning. And there is a part of me that agrees wholeheartedly with him, because the program that Mohini and I started and launched in India really focuses on, of course, the competencies and the knowledge that is required for women to go out and pursue successful careers. But a big chunk of that program is focused on the belief that there is a lot more that women need to be equipped with to be able to go out, face the challenges of the working world, and continue to stay in it as opposed to drop out. Now, much of this is focused on personal growth, transformation, the things you learn from your peer groups, the things you learn from engaging with faculty, with role models, a very specialized curriculum that focuses on things like confidence, assertiveness. Lots of this is about interpersonal engagement and the possibility of being able to really go through some sort of transformation. Now, the numbers may be smaller, but the ripple effect of that one largely transformed person is much bigger from the point of influencing their homes, society, their employers, and therefore the ripple effect is much, much higher. And I think that is what has suffered the most, in my view, for our program, that these young women have been cooped up in their homes. One of the ways in which we have tried to overcome that, both the digital divide in terms of access to, whether it's internet connectivity, whether it's devices, is that we have kept, through these 18, 20 months, we have kept our residential quarters open for our scholars. So a lot of what they would have otherwise suffered because of whether it is greater dependence on them for household chores or for caregiving, or the fact that they just didn't have connectivity or quiet space, at a huge amount of inconvenience to us, and beyond inconvenience, also just stress. Because imagine, through the first wave and the second wave in India, we have had to keep our wits about us to manage a group of 50, 60, 70, 100 women on campus and in the hostel. I think some of the other things that we said, that, if you are sort of lumped with the fact that it's hard to go on with physical classes and it does need to do digitally, what is it that we can do to make that experience the most helpful and the most impactful for our scholars? So we actually did some amount of training for faculty. What goes down well? A 2-hour class, which is the norm in our college. We changed that. People don't have the bandwidth to sit in front of their computers 2 hours at a stretch without a break. So we reduced the size or the length of our classes, and we did a lot of work with our faculty on what kind of structures they could bring into their lecture formats for it to give maximum engagement to our scholars. Whether it's breakout rooms, whether it is quick polls during the classroom, whether it is an activity-based engagement, but we did all of those things. For our students, we did 2 things. One, we changed assessment norms, because it really creates huge anxiety in the middle of already high levels of anxiety and stress when they are rated for group work online or for class participation online. So we changed all of that. We really did put the well-being of our scholars at the heart of the way we were thinking about assessments and the way we were delivering our programs, as opposed to sticking to old norms. We have a very inclusive admissions process. And I think that's something I would urge many institutions to look at, because one way to correct for what women suffer from is not to let the past dictate their future. So we really do focus on promise and potential in our young women as we admit them into our program, as opposed to going with the marks or the exposure that they have already had. And it's a small way of trying to see that we don't perpetuate the privilege that already exists in society. I want to close with the future. And while the numbers look better and there are more women enrolling in higher education, for us, the country that we are, education for the sake of education is tougher to justify than education for the sake of employment, for the sake of financial independence. And the truth is that even as more women have enrolled in higher education, the participation of women in India's workforce is dropping. It's dropped more than 10% in the last 10 to 15 years. And that's very, very worrisome, because what it does is it continues to tell families and I guess women themselves, one, that working is a matter of choice, and two, that their education is more like consumption expenditure as opposed to an investment. And
you have to start wrapping up now.
Yeah. So till such time that we make that change backwards, I think it's going to be very tough to be able to deliver higher education benefits to women. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Several really, I think, really useful ideas to think about there to make education under the pandemic better and maybe beyond the pandemic as well. Okay, so finally we have Shabana Basij-Rasikh. She is the founder and president of the School of Leadership Afghanistan and was awarded the country's highest civilian honor and featured in Forbes 30 under 30. She grew up in Kabul under the Taliban regime, and she also is a graduate of Oxford with a master's in public policy. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And I also want to say it has been such a sobering conversation just listening to all of this, but also in some ways inspiring, because for someone like me who's really deeply involved in this work in Afghanistan, hearing the risks facing girls in our region is more reason for us to stay focused and fight this fight for girls. So in Afghanistan, girls' education was a major challenge even prior to COVID. Around 3 million girls were out of school prior to COVID. That is roughly 63% of school-aged girls who were not in school before the pandemic hit. What that means also, as you heard all the speakers share stories from different perspectives, the pandemic has further amplified this challenge in Afghanistan as well. In March 2020, schools were shut down in Afghanistan, only to reopen very briefly in the fall of 2020 for a few weeks. When students returned to the new academic year in 2021, in March, they stayed in school for a couple of months only to go back home since the end of May, since this new wave of COVID in Afghanistan. So obviously, it's important to highlight that this has been an overall issue. This pandemic has impacted boys and girls, but as one of the speakers mentioned earlier, initially, it was said that around 10 million girls were at risk of not ever returning to school. And then that figure was updated to say, in fact, it could easily be between 10 to 20 million girls globally who will not return to school because of COVID. We even at SOLA, being the first and only boarding school for girls in Afghanistan, we had adopted online learning even prior to COVID, but that was something that was very helpful in continuity of learning for our students. Similar to what Pooja mentioned, we started off our students who hail from 28 of the 34 provinces in Afghanistan with very basic online learning. Initial assignments included things like talking about their their surroundings and what was happening, whether people were taking COVID seriously or not. And similarly, students were either taking pictures of their journals and sending it to us via WhatsApp or other text messaging apps. And because of security concerns that we have in Afghanistan, we weren't able to share those widely, but we have a phenomenal depository of stories shared by our students with us during this time. We've discussed at length the value and the risks associated with online learning, especially in the region. But in Afghanistan, poor communication infrastructure, fragile security makes remote learning almost impossible, unless girls are brought to a secure central location with reliable internet and this is extremely important, very, very stringent health protocols. And that was key to our success. We started off our students with online learning, but very, very quickly realized that there was such a strong disparity in their access, even within our nearly 100 girls from 28 provinces. We had girls who had Wi-Fi access at home, and then we had girls whose most advanced technology was receiving a text message, and that too in certain times of the day. So we quickly realized that it was important for us to bring our girls back to campus, since we are a residential boarding school. Luckily, we were able to secure permission from the Ministry of Education to bring our students. In groups, we prioritized our most disadvantaged girls, or girls who are living in very insecure districts in Afghanistan. Some of whom were living under Taliban-controlled districts, for instance. Or we also prioritized girls who were malnourished during this time in wherever they were. And slowly we're able to bring all of our students back to campus. And basically, by the time our students came to us on campus, and this is very important, we restarted the academic year for them. So kind of trying to meet all of our students where they were, not just picking up where our most advanced students were. And this was helpful for all of our students who, especially those who didn't have the support or resources to continue with their education during the time they were home. And that has been very key to our success. And fortunately, we haven't had a single case of COVID on campus. This again speaks to very stringent health protocols on campus. This is in a bit of a good story to say that in a country where all students, boys and girls, are not able to continue with their education, a boarding school model can provide continuity of learning in this kind of a environment. But with this also, there are some challenges that continue. One of the most pressing and leading, I guess the best way to put it is one of the biggest, the strongest barriers to girls' education in Afghanistan is shortage of teachers, but most particularly shortage of female teachers. The Ministry of Education published the statistics a while back, mentioning that around 60% of districts across Afghanistan don't have a single female teacher. And in a society like Afghanistan, where a lot of conservative families prefer that their daughters are taught by female teachers, this means that in communities where we don't have female teachers, girls are not able to continue with their education. And when girls are not able to continue with their education, we don't have local production of talent and educated women who could become female teachers. And so this becomes a vicious cycle in a way. And I do come back to saying that even for that too, boarding school models provide a brilliant solution to addressing all of these challenges facing girls in places like Afghanistan, in communities like Afghanistan. And as I listen to Pooja and others, really in all of the region where there are so many other barriers to girls' education, household responsibilities, caring for others, their education not being as valued, or the other way to put it, if the families have the means to, invest in one child, they always prefer the son over the daughter. So the boarding school model could become a brilliant solution to a lot of these issues that we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Shabana. That sounds quite interesting. I think that's a really, really interesting suggestion, actually, to potentially, solve this problem of the technological divide with by actually continuing in-person schooling instead. So I wonder whether all the panelists maybe could turn on their cameras for the discussion, so we feel like we're talking to each other rather than to a blank screen, which is always nice. So it seems like the issue of this technological divide and how that affects girls and boys differently is clearly a big issue, because that's something that I think nearly all of you brought up. So I was wondering if you could start by thinking a little bit more about alternative forms of learning. I really liked Shanila's suggestion that that this is, an opportunity to explore alternative forms of learning, and also maybe alternative forms of learning online even. And I was wondering if you all could reflect a bit more on what form those alternative forms of learning can take. Who wants to go first? Yeah, Shenila, go ahead.
I thought that I don't know if this was by design, but I thought the specific case studies from the country context were really an excellent illustration of community-based interventions that are happening. So I think if you think about what Shabana was speaking in relation to actually creating an alternate way of providing girls education through the boarding school model, the one in Pakistan that I was speaking about is technically that schooling used to happen at night school. So this is from 6 to 7 p.m. But because actually day schools were closed, they expanded their hours. And so just thinking in terms of how some of the mutual aid or community-based efforts, such as even providing the kind of support that other speakers were speaking about, that they are already they were already in place, but the pandemic in a way provides an opportunity for these spaces to be enhanced in some ways. And so now the onus might be on state governments to figure out how they might fund such endeavors, how you might scale them in ways so that we can actually have, we can replicate them across multiple fora, how we might create grants for them. The other idea that I thought seemed to be working across these contexts was in relation to social assistance and cash transfers. It seems that too can place, be it financial care packages like scholarships that Seuty was talking about, or other forms. And so it seems that there are certain social assistance interventions and mutual aid / community-based projects that seem to be working that we now need to figure out how to scale up and divert funding to.
Yeah, I think that's those are really, I agree, those are really good ideas. Are there any of the rest of you who have anything more you'd like to? I'd love to hear more about if you have any more thoughts on this. Yes, Seuty, go.
Cecilie, sorry, my my internet is terrible. I'm really sorry. I can't turn on my video. But one of the things we tried with the young girls that we work with is just to try and make the classrooms really, really small. So they're maybe 3 to 5 students, not more than that. And that way we keep them, very far apart from each other. And then we have a rooftop, so we just do it outdoors, so that then we're sure that they're safe. The problem for us then started coming when the girls had to go and help their parents work, you know. They just stopped showing up. And we tried, we collected money and sent relief packages of food and these kinds of stuff to their families as well. So it would help them financially a bit, so the girls would be freer to take their sessions. But eventually at a certain time, even that, it really decreased the number of the girls. So we're just trying to figure out different ways. And Shabana's what she said about the boarding school was quite interesting, actually. That seems to be like something that would work in Nepal as well, except we don't have government-run boarding schools in Nepal. We only have private schools, and then again comes the whole issue of, you know, money and class structure, right? So, yeah.
If I could, Pooja, this is maybe it's a conversation you and I can take offline as up on a greater detail as well. But for here, and someone here, I think it's Krishna, who asked the question about SOLA as a structure. So we are a private boarding school as well. And so we're not funded by the government. We are a nonprofit private boarding school. In that our model is very interesting. We prioritize girls from the most remote parts of Afghanistan, girls who often don't have the ability to continue with their education beyond 6th grade, or there is no school available in their village or community or district, or there is insecurity in their district. It's a contested district between Taliban and the Afghan government, and often one of the first things that one of the first services that goes away is girls' education. So when you enter SOLA, even though we're a private boarding school, predominantly, and I mean more than 96-7% of our students are girls who come from very disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. They are first girls in their families to get educated, and in some cases, they're the first person in their families to get educated. And so funding becomes a big question mark. How do we do this? We charge a symbolic tuition. So what I mean by that is we tell the families what it costs SOLA to educate their daughters per year. We share all the finances with them, and then we ask them to make an investment in their daughter. We make this mandatory because we very directly tell them that in Afghanistan, families often pay for their sons' education in a private school, but not for their daughters, and that they need to prove to us that all of our investment is worth it, and that they are also financially invested in their daughter's future, and that it will make their daughters proud that their families did what they best could to participate. So it is a small amount, but it's a significant amount for their families. And that works out very beautifully. As in terms of our support structure, we have registered as a nonprofit organization in the US, and we primarily raise funds in the US to support the operation of our boarding school in Kabul. Obviously, this too, to me, is not a sustainable model, because we can't year after year rely on fundraising efforts or donations from well-intentioned people to continue the operation of a boarding school. And so we're working towards financial sustainability. And one of the things we have looked at is setting up an endowment fund. We've already set that up, and our focus is to grow that, so that when, for instance, let's say a few years down the road, I'm no longer involved, or let's say even beyond my lifetime, I'm no longer involved with SOLA, that the endowment will ensure that SOLA's focus always remains girls from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, and not girls who come from well-off backgrounds who can afford the fee. So the endowment is one way for us to ensure that our admission process doesn't get compromised. And this is something Anuradha mentioned. I've actually visited their center and had the privilege of speaking with the girls who are phenomenal. It's so important to have a very inclusive approach to admission process. And to me, the endowment was a way to secure that inclusivity in our admission process in the long term.
Wow, thank you, Shabana. That sounds
Yeah,
very
I just wanted to add, taking on a little bit from Shabana, that, you know, we also, because we are smaller numbers still, we are able to speak with families to introduce this investment idea. But the other thing that we've done it because we are in higher education, and we feel very strongly that there needs to be financial independence for which we are educating or training our women. We actually are able to get them loans because we assure jobs to every girl who graduates from our program. And because there is almost like a guarantee of a job, you know, non-banking financial institutions and banks are able to come forward and give an educational loan so that these girls can study, and then post graduating from our program, they're able to pay back that loan. So the burden on the family is almost gone. But it also kicks in a very strong sense of responsibility, and the fact that we feel that if you're earning, then you should be willing to pay for your education. But in the pandemic, what has happened is families either have lost an earning family member, and then when girls come from very underprivileged backgrounds, they don't have the collateral that a bank asks for. And what we are doing now is setting up a rolling fund. So people are hesitant to contribute significant amounts of money if it just goes with that one batch. What we are saying now is put in the money for one scholar, it pays for that scholar, and when that scholar gets a job, they put the money back into the fund. So your contribution becomes a rolling fund for educating larger number of girls who don't actually have the collateral or the ability to get this money for their education.
I'm sorry, I'm going to let Seuty speak now because she wanted to speak earlier and didn't get the chance.
Hi, thanks again. One of the things that I think we are coming from a different vantage point as well, because tertiary education is very different from primary education. What we could achieve through BRAC education program, our primary education program is doing fabulously, and glitches are lesser, especially early childhood education and all of this. But when we come to tertiary education, I think it's not only the university, but also the attitude of the state towards the private university, and how there could be a private-public collaboration in so many ways. Because, as I said before, we are student fees run university. We do not have huge endowment as people would expect. And that is one of the things, because you can only share so much resources because you have to run the machineries as well. And I think it was great from our part, but at the same time, government also, the triad, the government, family, and institution, this has to work simultaneously together, because this is the crisis that, as I ended my conversation, is that this is the crisis that only education institution can't run by itself, because the kind of nurturing environment or ecosystem that we are thinking of needs this all stakeholders participation to secure the students' future. So I think we are talking very different kinds of institution as well. And also education is very expensive in private universities, and we must not lose sight of that. I mean, like the amount, almost 40% of our students are on scholarship, and we are not only teaching Bangladeshi students, but students from Africa, Nepal, I mean, African countries, especially Kenya, Sudan, and Pakistan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Afghanistani students as well. So there are multitude of problems dealing with those. And so it's not only the question of bandwidth, but also what kind of audience we have as a student and how we are interacting with them and how much we can do as an institution and how to build a sensible infrastructure which would actually look into students' future, not dividing them into along the private and public line, but also like a greater good. And I know I'm talking about utopia, but the things like that is the only way to go forward. And there has to be devices which would enable those environments for the students to thrive, because the kind of crisis that we are going through, it's not that we didn't anticipate, it just accelerated. These were already embedded within the systems. COVID only accentuated those. So it's not that this inequality didn't exist before. We are talking about inequality that has been enhanced, accelerated. So yes, if the future is digitalized, then you have to equip all of the stakeholders to deal with it, because this is not a one-stop solution. It's not a band-aid that you can put on and forget about the rest of the things, but inequality is something that has to be held. And the thing is that in the world of private endowment and all, what we are losing sight of is socialistic model or social welfare-ish model, where you could give more access and you could actually dispense the resources with somewhat equity, and that is not there. And I think that is one of the things that we are missing in the education system in general, especially in South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Seuty. Is there any of the rest of you who want to say anything otherwise on the subject? Otherwise, I think we can move on to some Q&A. Okay, it looks like nobody. So let's take some questions from the audience. So somebody's asked in the Q&A box here. He's saying increasing rate of early marriage, rape, deterioration of mental health, etc. of girl. I see. Girls. Let's see now. Sorry. Increasing rate of early marriage, rape, deterioration of mental health, etc. of girl students during pandemic may hamper education of girls. How can this challenge? Be addressed? So that's the question to the panelists. And Uma, did you want to speak on that first?
No. I just, I'm ticking off the questions from the question and answer section.
Okay, sounds good. How about any of the panelists in that case? Nobody? I think Anuradha was talking about the structures around the girls, which I was also very interested in, how one can improve the structures around the girls that kind of, keep them safe despite online learning.
I mean, sort of just reflecting on the question, Cecilie, I'm not sure that the rate of early marriage has, at least, I mean, I haven't really delved into it, but I haven't also come across any data or reportage that suggests that marriages are happening earlier in the pandemic. I think there are reports of violence being up in closed quarters, but and of course mental health in general has increased, and I think the mental health piece is, at least in educational institutions that I know, I think there is very, very high levels of awareness around the fact that this pandemic has brought about disproportionate levels of mental illness or mental health requirements for reasons that are way beyond just gender. I think so. There is a cognizance and a willingness to support it. I think all campuses that I know have upped the support of counselors. Our program teams are trained to sort of identify and then support mental health. But I think on our part as institutions, the best that we can do is, one, of course, be supportive, but also try and reduce as much as possible things that lead to greater anxiety. And examples of, how you assess people, how they come in, and like this rolling fund that we are talking about is really a response to the fact that financial situations of many families have changed because of the pandemic. So I think at an overall level, I'm not so sure what we can do for sort of early marriage and rape and things like that related to the pandemic. I think there is systemic change that we are all working towards to address these issues in general.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I've also found it interesting that Shenila was saying that, schools have closed, day schools have closed in Pakistan. Evening schools have opened up and sort of expanded. And it seems to me that if evening schools are anyway running and expanding, then why not just keep the schools open? And Shabana was saying that, these they've actually managed to run these boarding schools quite well. So I mean, maybe shifting back to more in-person learning might be another option that would both improve people's mental health and deal with the problem of girls disappearing out of education. Because I know certainly, I mean, I also run a school in a village in Pakistan with my husband, and we've been ordered to close our school for most of the year, which means that most of these children are at home, but life around the school goes on as usual. So it seems like the schools have closed down, but everything else is normal. And why close the schools and then deprive all these children of education when everything else is running as normal?
Yes, actually, that's a great point, and that's exactly same challenge here in Afghanistan. The schools and universities were the first to be shut down, and this. Everyone here in the audience can relate because we're talking primarily with a South Asian audience. Weddings are at full speed taking place. So this is something that we need to reflect on as a society as well, that what we give priority to. But besides that, one of the things I wanted to actually clarify and make sure it's clear is that we have been able to do a hybrid of in-person and online learning. So by bringing our students all back to campus, we've been able to make sure that the students have each other and they have reliable access to internet, etc., proper nutrition, etc. But we've kept our teachers at home. So they teach classes remotely. The difference is that all of the students are in the same classroom. And so that's how we have been able to create this COVID protective bubble and 0 cases of COVID. Otherwise, our teachers going home to their home environments, which is completely outside of our control, we would not have been able to manage this well. What we did instead was we doubled the number of our residential life staff and kept them on a rotation. So once our residential life support, like dorm parents and others came on board, and they would do the PCR test, quarantine for 14 days while on campus, and then they stay on for 4 weeks, and they stay on the whole time, and then we send them home for another 4 weeks. So they would rotate that way, because they ended up being our only adult supervision on campus during the pandemic. But this issue of schools being the first to get closed and last to open is a serious problem in South Asia right now.
Yes, I think you're right. I think I've found that puzzling all through the pandemic, particularly considering the big weddings going on and spreading COVID that way. Seuty, what do you want to ask?
Yeah, I think we are also talking about which bodies are dispensable. I think garments workers' body is way more dispensable than a school-going child. I mean, this is how the class system works, and it's not about the priority. I think, yes, it is about priority, but at the same time, who should be saved and who shouldn't be. And that is something, so when we are talking about this triad, is essentially, I am also talking about this like social investment and prioritizing what we invest in. That is also important to think through, because the thing is, and it's not about the wedding versus school, but also garments worker versus school. For me, that is much more relevant, and which school. And the thing is, like, for universities or English medium schools, the schools are going online, but look at the primary schools, because I'm also a mother of a young child, and I have, I know of my support staff at office and outside. Their children are not going to school and doing their exams privately for 1.5 years. So the experiences across the class varies. So it's not only the universities, but also, and even in the universities, public universities actually staggeringly open, where private university just went head on and started doing the things that they could do. So yes, we are talking about different layers of divisions as well, and also lack of social investment that I've been talking about, and I'm trying to point it again and again. I know it's not very interesting place to go, but yeah, that is something that we are facing.
I think that's very important, and I agree. There's a question here from somebody who asked something in the YouTube chat. Rishi Rajvanshi asks thoughts on efficacy of mass media solutions like radio, TV, etc. during the pandemic. Any thoughts on this?
I think I could address this with the previous question on as well, that we didn't get to address much. From what I have seen and the challenges that we have, you know, we've for instance, in the case of Afghanistan, we've discovered that any reliance on internet when internet access is not reliable or equitable is not going to work. And so this other mediums, I know there are cases cited of, you know, success in South Asia, for instance, places like Nepal, about TV and radio programming. I don't see that being successful in Afghanistan, and there are reasons. I think this comes back to the education systems that we have. If our education systems do not empower educators and do not give them the autonomy that they deserve in their classrooms at the school level, these things don't work. So often you've seen that government interventions on this level works well when at the most local level, teachers are autonomous and have agency to look out for their students. And when you have communities where the central government calls all the shots, to even in some cases like Afghanistan, the hiring and firing of principals of schools, this doesn't work. Because when you have autonomous teachers, when they feel that the system is with them, then they can also address issues of stress, mental health, even domestic violence and abuse, and those cases. But without that kind of autonomy, these kinds of mass media solutions, though I'm not an expert in this particular matter per se, I don't see it being as effective in places like Afghanistan.
All right, then we have, there's another question in the Q&A here, which I first thought was basically the same as the last one, but it's one asking how challenges with deteriorating mental health due to school closure and dropping out because of the transforming number of families into newly poor may hamper, hold on. So he's saying the deterioration of mental health due to school closure and dropping out because of transforming families into newly poor may hamper education for boys and girls. And how can we address these challenges? And other people also, you're welcome to put more questions into the chat, into the Q&A box, or raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. we still have some time left for questions. But does anyone want to speak to the mental health problem? I was also wondering earlier whether, this problem of online, fatigue, sort of Zoom fatigue, as they call it, would be, how one could address that, or, and simultaneously maybe address the technology gap between boys and girls by maybe creating some sort of alternative forms of learning that don't include don't use as high levels of technology. I wonder if that would be something that could be a solution. Let's see, nobody has any thoughts on that. Seuty, do you want to say something?
Sorry, I think some of those questions were answered in my presentation. I don't know whether you noticed, because I talk a lot about mental health. I mean, mental health issue, and especially mental health of young adolescent girl and the students that we are teaching is a huge issue. And I've mentioned about the suicide and the fatigue and this how you call it, displacement from the natural setup for them. So these are the things that we are experiencing every day, and there are counsel services that are being provided, but there are one-on-one solutions as well. There are cases in classes where we actually created special assessment for students with anxiety and depression. We have given them longer time to deal with the situation, not necessarily easier questions, but sometimes also we opted for not written paper, which would tie them longer, but also having the one-on-one interview on a particular topic. So it was a verbal exam rather than written exams. But also it's not only about students, but the fatigue is equally problematic for us. I mean, who takes care for the carer? Because we are all juggling, and especially when you are staying at home and you have young children to look after and do the family chores that you anyways do, and being locked into your room for hours and hours is something that's a privilege, and most of my colleagues don't have that privilege. Many of my colleagues don't have that privilege. Also, we are talking about the ecosystem as well for the students and for the teachers as well, whether they have the ecosystem where this online classes are, I mean, whether they're being able to avail the online classes. And I've also mentioned the surveillance of parents, both in case of boys and girls, but especially for girls, and intervening constantly. It's not about the household chores only, but also not understanding the amount of pressure students are going through, because when they're outside in the university for a longer period of time, they're at the university, in the lab, they're working, so parents never get to see what they go through day in, day out. Now, the things like when they are experiencing that is becoming another problem and creating another level of creating a new trepidations for students, because these are something that they have to deal with day in, day out, and that also adds to the stress. So it's not only work-related stress, not only like long hours, but also like induced stress by the family members. So these are the things that they're constantly dealing with. Some of us actually tried to address those in orientations, but it's not enough. It's never enough. And the things like in person, you can answer the questions, you can kind of try to make sense, you could give time to parents who are curious, who are hovering helicopter parenting and things like that, or people who are absolutely distant and doesn't have ability to relate to what their children are doing. That there are the cases. So yes, I mean, like, these are the issues that we are dealing with, and we deal with as we go. I mean, there is no perfect set of tool that we are equipped with, but and I think things like our counseling service has done a tremendous job. But I really thank my peer who went out of their way and help the students not only with their academic needs but also emotional needs. That has been the case for all of us, actually. Thank you.
In the case of Afghanistan, it's slightly different because, you know, if you look at Afghanistan, we're dealing with the kind of issues, even with the third wave of COVID, that's not the news. You know, I mean, you all understand how big of a news that was coming out of India. But in Afghanistan, given its size, still a lot of people died of COVID, though we have other issues that are the headlines for us today, unfortunately. So with all of this, counseling services, mental health issues are on no one's list, on no one's priority list, unfortunately. We as a school have struggled with this quite a lot. We've constantly been seeking help and making sure that we can find local counselors who can understand and relate to our students. We have, with much difficulty, found that and tried to remove the stigma associated with seeking help for mental health issues by bringing in counselors to offer group sessions, just talking, offering tips on self-care and issues, followed by one-on-one sessions if anyone desires to take them. And slowly we have seen a lot of our students show interest in taking those sessions. But we're one small school in this country of 36 plus million people, where this is a major problem. So if you think about it on scale, you know, this will be a long battle for Afghanistan to get this right. Because if you look at it, every single person in Afghanistan could benefit from counseling and that kind of a support. We've been in an ongoing state of war, and every single one of us have experienced something that has given us PTSD, and yet we don't have enough of that kind of support. The good news is that a lot of young Afghans are starting to take interest in this field, and my hope is that we will soon see a lot of Afghan-led initiatives offering mental health support and services for people who can really rely on these and benefit from this. But in case of Afghanistan, I'm afraid I don't have a better answer other than saying that we're trying to figure it out for our small community of students. But the one thing that has helped is a very good relationship with the families. You know, during this pandemic, creating a COVID protective bubble, for instance, for several of our students, it's been very challenging. Girls who've been used to seeing their families on weekends, or you know, whenever their families come to Kabul for a visit from their province, being able to come into campus and visit with the girls, we have completely limited those because of COVID. And in cases where our students have been, you know, so stressed and just ready to say, you know what, I don't think I can do this anymore, I need to be home. It's been a wonderful collaboration with the parents of our students to keep our students interested and engaged. And mind you, these are not girls who are not motivated. These are incredibly driven girls at SOLA who, I mean, we never have to tell them to study. They're really phenomenal. But the point is that the time, you know, COVID has had a lot of impact on them, and the collaboration with parents have been key.
Yeah, that sounds very good. Actually, related to that,
I just want to add one thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, Cecile.
Right.
On top of what everybody else said, of course, one of the things we found that has really worked for us when working with young people and their mental health is keeping their sessions as creative as possible. So adding elements of creativity, you know, whether it's drawing, whether it's singing, whether it's dancing, getting them to move around a bit, whatever, some sort of creativity. So if we do lecture them about something, then after 10 minutes, we ask them, all right, like, can you draw a picture about what you just heard, you know? And so those slides I shared with you, those images I shared with you on the slide with the LGBTI Pride month was that, you know, after having trans activists talk to them about LGBTI rights, they basically within like 10 minutes drew those, and then later they colored it and sent it to us, you know, so that seems to also help a lot with their mental health.
Thank you, Pooja. That sounds very useful. There's a question here to Shabana in the Q&A box from Saima Khan. So she's wondering, how are educated Afghani women breaking the vicious cycle related to demand of female teachers to educate girls?
That's actually a great question in many ways, but it's not actually just Afghan women. Actually, there are a lot of Afghan men who are trying to break this cycle, which is very, very hopeful, because in this conversation, involvement of men is so critical. It just normalizes girls' education when men and brothers and fathers and husbands are in the picture. I'll give you one quick example from this year's admission process for SOLA. We have received a record number of applications from close to 300 from 31 provinces for initially 16 spots that we had available in our 6th grade class. These are girls who are roughly between the ages of 10 to 12. And for the first time, I noticed that we received around 30 applications from girls who have never, ever been to school before. So illiterate girls. And one of the ones that was particularly interesting for me was a village elder who came to Kabul to speak with us. And he told us that he lives in a village of around 30,000 people, no school for girls, but knows about SOLA because there's one girl in that entire village who's educated, and that girl attends SOLA. And he said that none of his daughters had been to school, and he wanted us to admit one of his daughters in the hopes that when she comes home for breaks, she would educate the rest of her sisters, but also other girls in the village, especially because he was a village elder and people in the village would trust to send their daughters to his house to get educated. We ended up, admitting not one, but 3 of his daughters. And these girls we admitted in a very specific program that we created this year. For the first time, we have 6 girls in a pre-6th grade program. These are 6 girls from different parts of Afghanistan between the ages of 9 and 12. And they are illiterate. I mean, they are illiterate to a point where when I spoke with a couple of them, they couldn't count beyond 10. And so we hired at least one teacher who works primarily one-on-one with these girls. And these girls are now home. They've been with us since the beginning of, since the beginning of the academic year in March, and they went home for the Eid break, having finished 1st and 2nd grade in this very short span of time. And so what is going to happen is, the idea is that within a couple of years, we will accelerate their education between 1st and 5th grade with the hopes of enrolling them into our 6th grade program. And so this is really trying to address that vicious cycle I was talking about in districts, one girl at a time. Though we're a very small school, this, it would require similar efforts from both government and private sector to accelerate girls' access to education in a way to turn this vicious cycle into a virtuous one, in which these educated girls then go home to their villages and educate other girls. Already the ripple effect is pretty profound. But that is one example where young girls, young women, educated women who do this. Today, Afghanistan has a robust civil society organization. It used to be that city women would represent women from provinces and rural Afghanistan, but today women in rural Afghanistan represent themselves. We have really phenomenal young Afghan women activists who speak up and speak out on several issues related to their communities, and it's really wonderful, and yet quite fragile given the political situation in Afghanistan right now.
Thank you, Shabana. And I think we don't unfortunately have time for more, but it was nice to end on sort of a somewhat positive note, at least, because I think what we've discovered is that although there are things that are bleak, it's not all terrible and bleak, and there are some opportunities and some sort of new forms of learning and so on that are emerging out of this pandemic. So that's something that we can take with us and hopefully bring forward even beyond the pandemic. So thank you so much to all of you panelists and everybody who came and joined us. And I will leave it to Uma or Mohini to tell us when the next session is.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cecile, for chairing and moderating this roundtable so well. We really appreciate your support in running this conference. And of course, thank you to all our speakers, Shenila, Pooja, Seuty, Anuradha, and Shabana, for a really rich discussion in this roundtable. We feel really very privileged to hear your perspective on gender and education, and a lot of important issues for us all to think about. And really thank you for all the important work that you have been doing as well. In continuation with this theme, our next paper presentation panel will start at 3:45 UK time, and it'll be also on gender. It'll be in room A, chaired by Sangeeta Thebe Limbu, and simultaneously we'll have another session in room B on the theme of methods, chaired by Nimesh Dhungana. But before we go for a break, as we are coming to the end of this conference, it'll be really good to get some feedback on how you've been finding this conference. There'll be a very short poll that will now pop up on your screen, and we'd be most grateful if you could send us your responses. It will just take a few seconds, but it'll really help us to get a sense of how the event is going. We will keep this on during the break, and thank you very much everyone again, and we'll see you after the break.
Thank you.
The poll should now pop up on your screen. We'll keep this on during the break as well.